Hello everyone, welcome to the first episode of the series Basic Endgames with the Technique Master. I am Chekas, and in this series you will be learning endgames that we consider essential for players to know. Endgames are very objective positions. The less pieces are on the board, the clearer the position gets, to the point where we can tell with 100% certainty if those positions are winning or if it's just a draw. The more simplifications happen on the board, the more clear the fog gets. The endgame is where pieces show their true power and all their resources. By studying endgames, you will learn how to play plenty of positions that are objectively winning. So you no longer have to only play the middle game trying to find combinations that give you material or end in a checkmate. It will also give you the possibility to just simplify the position and go into a non-winning endgame. It doesn't matter if the endgame takes 20 moves to win. If it's winning, it's winning. There will be just so many more ways to win games that it will be almost impossible for you to blank and get out of plans. Michael Jordan once said, "Maybe I made you think my highlight started at the free throw line and not at the gym." It remarkably compares to the endgame. We study endgames to win games beforehand. Let's start with king and pawn versus king endgames, specifically when a central pawn is on the 5th rank. Then the way to win the position is to get into one of the key squares with the king. In the case of having the d pawn, as in the example, the key squares are the 3 squares in front of the pawn, c6, d6, and e6. If the white king can get there without moving the pawn, then it's a win. Otherwise, it's a draw. Here is why to move, and if black plays correctly, it should be a draw, because after king e5, king e7, black's king gets the opposition. The opposition is a special resource kings have in the endgame, to block the opposite king to access important squares. And in this case, the opposition is enough to draw the game. However, let's just show what will happen if black makes a mistake like king d8. Then king d6 gets into the key squares and gains a position for white. Now it should be a win. King e8 and king c7. The white king protects the d6, d7 and d8 squares, and it's time for the pawn to move forward and promote. In order for black to keep the opposition, he plays king e7. After d6, king d7, king d5, king d8. Only move to keep the position. King e8 is a mistake. After king e6, white gets in front of the black king and gains the opposition. King d8, d7, king c7, king e7. So after king d8, white tries king e6, king e8, keeping the position, very important, d7 check, king d8, and king d6, stalemate. The second position is when the pawn is not yet on the 5th rank. Then the way to win the position is to get into one of the key squares marked on the board. Of course, it depends on the pawn. If the pawn is on e4, then the key squares are d6, e6, and f6. In this case, if it's white to move, it wins with king f6, and the pawn will promote. If it was black to move, then it's a draw with king e7, thanks to the opposition. King f5, king f7, blocking the access to e6 and f6, king e5, king e7. The black king gets in front and blocks the access to the key squares. Remember, the king has to get into the key squares without moving the pawn in order to win the game. Now we will see another important resource the kings have in pawn endgames, the triangulation. The triangulation is an important maneuver to get to the same position but with the other side to play, mostly used to break out of the opponent's opposition, like we will see in the next example. Here black has the opposition because the kings are in front of each other and it's white to move. However, white can break black's opposition without moving his pawns, thanks to the triangulation maneuver. King e5. Notice that c6 doesn't work because of the move king c8, but not b takes c6 check, king c5, king d8, king d6. Important to keep the position. King c8, king takes c6, king b8, b7, and white wins. So after king c8, king d6, king b8, king d7, b takes c6, and we know this endgame is a draw after king takes c6 because black wins the opposition with king c8. So going back to the initial position, king e5, king c6 keeps the opposition. If king e7, white has the resource of c6, promoting one of the pawns. So after king c6, king d4, and now we notice an important distinction. In order for black to keep the position, he needs the d6 or the c7 square, but they are protected by the pawns. There is no move other than king d7, and now white plays king d5, winning the opposition. It's the same position as in the beginning, but now black to move. Now it's just a matter of keeping the position to win. King c8, king e6, king d8, king d6, king c8, king e7, king b8, king d7, king a8, c6, and after the pawn captures, king c7, and white promotes. It's very important to go back and check why white has this maneuver. In the original position, we see that white has the squares e5, d4, and d5 available, while black has only the c6 and d7 squares. Black cannot make its way back to d7 in 3 moves, which makes it lose the opposition to the white king. Very instructive. The last ending for today will be the rule of the square. We have seen what happens when the pawn gets blocked by a king and the other king has to protect him. But what happens when both kings are far away from the pawn, as in the example? Then we apply the rule of the square by drawing an imaginary square using a diagonal from the pawn to the 8th rank, like in the position, and connecting it to the promotion square of the pawn to finish the square. The rule is the next. If the black king can get into the square, then the king catches the pawn and it's a draw. If the king cannot get into the square, the pawn promotes and wins. In this case, if it's black to move, then it catches the pawn with king f4. If it's white to move, then white wins with b5. The square is getting smaller each time the pawn advances. Let's check a quick example. Right now it's white to play, and it will be a mistake to play immediately a4, because the black king gets into the square and catches the pawn. But white has a smart resource to prevent the black king to enter the square, with d5. Excellent move that forces black to capture, otherwise the d-pawn is promoting. So after e takes d5, a4, and apparently the king catches the pawn anyways, because it gets into the square. Or does he? Because after a5, now the king is blocked by its own pawn and cannot get into the square, which means white promotes and wins the game. And that's all for today's video. I hope you learned something from today. I recommend you to go over the endings on this video a couple of times to really understand all the resources and why they work. Learning endgames might be tedious for some people, but I think it's actually amazing the amount of maneuvers that can happen even when there are only a few pieces on the board. Endgames give pieces the possibility to really shine. Study the endgames. It's really worth it. Thank you for watching, and I see you on the next video.